he murders the entire family. He comes back for the little child and murders him, takes his head.
I read that
wild.
the studio was not happy with that scene, and they were like, we can't have a kid be killed in this way. And Tim Burton was like, it's rated R. He's like, the thing that I hated as a kid growing up is seeing kids put in peril and then always saved. And he like really wanted kids to die in this movie. So like we get like an unborn child was murdered, like the pregnant mother was murdered, and then the kid like that I mean, that scene's terrifying for a child. Like he comes back for the child and pulls him out of the floor, and like, you know, he's killed off screen.
He's killed off screen, but he's like you can see him shoving a third head into the bag. Welcome, friends, to episode 178 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we're discussing Washington Irving's 1820 short story and Tim Burton's 1999 film, Sleepy Hollow. All right, James, the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, spring is in the air, and for some reason we decided to talk about a Halloween story.
Yep. Heads will roll.
I feel like we goofed up a little bit on this one, but you know, it's fun. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for promoting like spooky season year round horror.
Yeah,
this isn't even really horror as much as it's like really a Halloween like spooky story.
That was the mistake. I completely agree. Like, horror should be embraced year round. It doesn't need to just be a Halloween thing, in my opinion. But this story is very Halloween, and I didn't remember that because it had been a while. Getting into it, I was like, damn, like the short story itself is very like autumnal, and there's a lot of like leaves changing, and it feels like a ghost story, and it definitely has that vibe. And then, you know, then you get into the movie, and it's full on Halloween up and down. So yeah, it's a little weird to be covering it in April, I think, but
yeah, but I love the opportunity to jump into this one because like I got to dive into Tim Burton in a way I hadn't in a long time.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it's gotten to the point now where there's like a Tim Burton and Johnny Depp fatigue, but like this movie was before that, and I think we should think about both of think of them now and think of them then, and kind of especially think about the fact that like Tim Burton is a very distinct stylistic director, right? Like, you know, a Tim Burton movie when you see one, and I think that is something to be like celebrated in film, like different voices and someone who's clearly created a niche in and of himself.
I completely agree. I have a lot to say about the movie. We're going to start off though by talking about that old short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and I have some background information on Washington Irving that I definitely want to share with you. Before we get to that though, this weekend, I am going to be attending the Flights of Foundry convention, which is a virtual free convention. It's very focused on like writers, podcasters. It seems like some filmmaking, comic books, all kinds of stuff. And I am on two panels. I'm going to be moderating two panels. One is called Podcast Care and Feeding, How to Manage Expectations, Grow Your Audience, and Keep Momentum. And the second is called From Verbal to Visual, Adapting Art for the Screen. Both of those panels are on Saturday, the 17th. So if you'd like to check them out, like I said, they're free. And then I think there might be a version of them that's going to get posted to YouTube, but it'll depend on, I think if everybody signs off on that, you know, happening. So I can't guarantee that. But if they do, I'm sure I can throw it on like a playlist on our YouTube channel, I think, so people can find it that way. But yeah, I hope people check that out. That if any of that sounds interesting, should be fun. I think one is like at 10 a.m. Pacific, and then the other is at like 8 p.m. Pacific on Saturday. So check that out.
Yeah, I plan on being in the chat and like participating in those.
Yeah.
So I'll
be
there.
Heckle me?
Yeah, for sure.
This story, though, I mean, like, it was a fun, like, I don't know about you, but it was kind of delightful to get into this mode at this time of year. Like, it took me a minute because I was like, this feels weird. This doesn't feel like the right time to be looking at pumpkins and getting all spooky. But, like, once I got into it, it was kind of a nice, I don't know, change of pace from the actual weather I'm seeing outside my window right now.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me look forward to autumn when it eventually comes.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting story too, because like it is written in the 1800s, but it didn't feel it didn't feel very dated to me. There was some wordsmithing happening, a lot of elongated words
some
and
flowery
like sort of
descriptions of weather. He loved to talk about the weather for sure.
Yeah.
It seemed like he was trying to I don't know. It seemed like there was a real one-upsmanship going on with writers at the time when talking about weather. It was like, I'm going to just really nail the way this sunset looks.
I'm going to make you feel this breeze on your face right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of funny, but I liked it though. It was well written.
Yeah.
It's just there's a reason why at this point people are like, man, maybe don't do that so much, because I think these guys nailed it back in the day. All these writers from the 1800s, they wore it out to where now it's yeah, if you're going to talk about the weather, find a different way to talk about it that's interesting and not just describe it in the utmost detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something nice about it too, because it's fun to and I don't want to compare this story to Shakespeare, but going back and reading Shakespeare, there's a lot more subtext and things built into his writing than I think appears here, but it's nice because it's so different in ways.
Yeah, Irving's a well-known writer. I definitely want to talk about the story with you, but before we do that, let's talk about the guy, right? Do you know anything about him?
So little. I know almost nothing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Washington Irving was born in 1783 and died in 1859. I think this makes him the oldest author we've covered who wasn't I think because we covered some old legends from the Grimm's fairy tales and stuff, but those were collected stories, whereas he is the author of this. So I think he's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, we've covered. He was an American short story writer, essayist, biographer, historian, and diplomat of the early 19th century. He is best known for his short stories Rip Van Winkle in 1819 and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820. So there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about this guy. I'll focus on just a few things. So in the spring of 1819, Irving sent to his brother Ebenezer in New York a set of short prose pieces that he asked to be published as the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent. I do not know why it is named that, but that's the name of it. The first installment, containing Rip Van Winkle, was an enormous success, and the rest of the work would be equally successful. It was issued in 1819 to 1820 in 7 installments in New York and in 2 volumes in London. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow would appear in the 6th issue of the New York edition and the 2nd volume of the London edition. Like many successful authors of the era, Irving struggled against literary bootleggers. In England, some of the sketches were reprinted in periodicals without his permission, a legal practice as there was no international copyright law at the time. To prevent further piracy in Britain, Irving paid to have the first 4 American installments published as a single volume in London. Irving's reputation soared, and for the next 2 years, he led an active social life in Paris and Great Britain, where he was often feted as an anomaly of literature, an upstart American who dared to write English well.
That is something about the story that I found fascinating, was that it's so American. It's so wrapped up in post-Revolutionary War, these small villages and did you know this stuff about Hessian mercenaries? Are you familiar?
Not a lot.
Okay, so Hessian mercenaries were Germans who were basically they were kind of mercenaries, but they weren't, because their government was loaning them to the British, and they were using them as soldiers in the Revolutionary War against the Americans. And what's crazy that I learned is that 25% of land troops that fought in the American Revolution that were on the British side were Hessian soldiers, basically.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's what the Headless Horseman ends up being. He's a Hessian who was killed in battle.
Well, and speaking of what we were talking about with the Brothers Grimm stuff, there is some implication that Irving was at least inspired by ghost stories of the area, because he went to Sleepy Hollow, which is a real place in New York. And in fact, Washington Irving is buried there in a cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, apparently a very simple headstone. So yeah, he had been there, I think, in his childhood, and then he wrote this story when he was abroad in Europe. It seemed like he was inspired by the stories he heard at the time, and it's still apparently considered to be one of the most haunted places in America, which, take that for what it's worth, but that's what it's considered. So Irving is largely credited as the first American man of letters and the first to earn his living solely by his pen. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow acknowledged Irving's role in promoting American literature in 1859, saying, quote, "We feel a just pride in his renown as an author, not forgetting that, to his other claims upon our gratitude, he adds also that of having been the first to win for our country an honorable name and position in the history of letters." So yeah, I mean, he was well respected. He's famous for popularizing the nickname Gotham for New York City.
Interesting. Which we're gonna touch on that in a little bit.
Really, and he is also credited with inventing the expression, quote, "the almighty dollar."
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he's very American, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is also interesting to think of like the British writing community, looking at American writers at the time and thinking like they were, just upstarts and they weren't necessarily on the same level, and then someone like this comes along and is accepted and has a social, like you said, like is a part of the social circles in Europe and stuff.
He was incredibly popular, very well known, renowned, as he went on. Unlike like Edgar Allan Poe and people like that, made a lot of money off of his work. He was an early like advocate for authors being an actual profession that you should get paid to do. Mm-hmm. And so he was a proponent of like copyright, things like that. A lot of these early things, he was involved in. And so, I think that's cool. Shout out to him for all that, because that's all very important, because, writing is a legitimate profession and should be treated like that. So, I think he's absolutely, it's cool to know that he's like one of the forefathers of that, at least in our country, of like fighting for that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Very cool.
I mean, there's a ton known about him. I could get into his life and stuff, but like, I'll just touch on stuff as if it comes up and it seems interesting, because we have a lot to cover here. I know that. So let's talk about the story itself. I'm going to read a synopsis so we can differentiate it, because I know some people will have clicked on this because they've only seen the movie maybe and haven't read this story. So I'll read a quick summary of it so you can kind of understand how it's different, because it is very different. And, actually, before we get into that, I did want to say, this thing has been adapted a ton of times. I wrote down just some of the notable ones, so let's run through them real quick. In 1922, a silent film, which starred Will Rogers as Ichabod Crane. It was adapted in 1949, called The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, by Walt Disney. Which was later released as Just the Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1958. Of course, the 1999 film that we're going to be covering. On television, it was adapted in 1980, called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, starring Jeff Goldblum.
Holy crap, that's awesome.
1980. And then 1985, there was an episode of Shelley Duvall's Tall Tales and Legends called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
I heard about that as well.
Yeah. There was one called The Tale of the Midnight Ride in 1994 as an episode of Nickelodeon series Are You Afraid of the Dark that serves as a sequel to the original story.
That was my shit. Are You Afraid of the Dark was so awesome.
Yeah, and then there was one called The Hollow in 2004, which was a film of ABC family television film which focused on the teenage descendant of Ichabod Crane. And then, of course, 2013 TV show Sleepy Hollow, which was a crime horror series in which Ichabod Crane is reimagined as an English professor and turncoat during the Revolutionary War, who awakens in the 21st century. Anyway, you may have heard of this one. That's another fairly famous one.
I didn't see any of that. I remember when it came out, though.
There's 4 seasons of it that ran.
That's wild.
Yeah. I watched some episodes.
Was it like ABC?
I don't have it here. Yeah, I don't remember.
Gotcha.
I don't have it here, but yeah, I think it was one of the major networks like that, like an ABC or something,
Fox or something, maybe.
Yeah. So I just thought it was cool. Like this is, and that's just like TV and film. There's also like plays and music, and like it's a foundational horror story, especially when it comes to like ghost stories in our country. So it's a very American. It's very Halloween, and a lot of the like jack-o'-lantern stuff comes back to this. Like it wasn't invented. Like it was a thing. It was a thing over in Europe, but Irving's tale kind of talked about the pumpkin prominently, which we'll get into, and around this time it started becoming more of a thing. I don't know how much of it his original tale explicitly ties it to it, But the adaptations over time strongly started reinforcing the jack-o'-lantern motif, which became such a big iconic thing for like how we celebrate Halloween in our country.
I mean, even outside of Sleepy Hollow, I feel like a headless horseman has become a thing in other stories as well.
So I was seeing that headless horseman is like a famous kind of apparition from Europe.
Gotcha.
Where apparently, it always has to do with like a vengeful spirit, or like, people see it if they've been not treating the dead with respect, things like that. I think, and you can summon these spirits, and it often does have to do with like battlefields, because there's so many battlefields where soldiers died, and so often it's a soldier, which is the case here. So, but let's actually talk about the story, because the story is pretty interesting. The story is set in 1790 in the countryside around the Dutch settlement of Tarrytown in a secluded glen known as Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is renowned for its ghosts and the haunting atmosphere that pervades the imaginations of its inhabitants. The most infamous specter in the hollow is the Headless Horseman, supposedly the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been shot off by a stray cannonball, and who rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. The legend relates the tale of Ichabod Crane, an extremely superstitious schoolmaster from Connecticut, who competes with Abraham Brom Bones Van Brunt, the town rowdy, for the hand of 18-year-old Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and sole child of a wealthy farmer, Baltus Van Tassel. Bones, who's unable to force Ichabod into a physical showdown to settle things, plays a series of pranks on the schoolmaster. The ambitious Crane then attends a harvest party at the Van Tassel's homestead. He dances, partakes in the feast, and listens to ghostly legends told by Brom and the locals. But his true aim is to propose to Katrina after the guests leave. After failing to secure Katrina's hand, Ichabod rides home on his temperamental horse, crestfallen, through the woods between Van Tressel's farmstead and the farmhouse in Sleepy Hollow where he is quartered. After nervously passing a lightning-stricken tree, Ichabod encounters a cloaked rider at an intersection in a menacing swamp. Unsettled by his fellow travelers' eerie sighs and silence, the teacher is horrified to discover that his companion's head is not on his shoulders, but on his saddle. In a frenzied race to the bridge adjacent to where the Hessian is said to vanish according to the rule in a flash of fire and brimstone before crossing it, Ichabod rides for his life. However, while Crane is able to cross the bridge ahead of the ghoul, Ichabod turns back in horror to see the monster rear his horse and hurl his severed head directly at him. The missile strikes his head and sends him tumbling into the dust from his horse. The next morning, Ichabod has mysteriously disappeared from the area, leaving Katrina to later marry Brom Bones, who was said to, quote, look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related. Indeed, the only relics of the schoolmaster's flight are his discarded hat, a trampled saddle, and a mysterious shattered pumpkin. Although the true nature of both the Headless Horseman and Ichabod's disappearance that night are left open to interpretation, the story implies that the horseman was really Brom in disguise, and suggests that Crane survived the fall and immediately fled Sleepy Hollow in horror, never to return but to prosper elsewhere, or perhaps was killed by Brom himself. Irving's narrator concludes the story by stating that the old Dutch wives continued to promote the belief that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and a legend develops around his disappearance, and sightings of his melancholy spirit.
Yeah, I do love in true ghost story fashion, there's like a bit of ambiguity at the end of the story, which, then other filmmakers and other people can adapt and run with and stuff. But I really did appreciate that in the story. Yeah, of course you can imply that maybe he survived and ran away or whatever, or maybe he was actually killed, but who knows? Maybe it was a fucking Headless Horseman,
Yeah. I think the story heavily implies that there was no horseman, which is interesting, right? Like, because this was a time where people believed in ghost stories. I mean, people still do, but like, I would think this would be a lot more prevalent, but it was also a time where maybe people were more worried about like bringing the wrath of these kind of spirits on, so that maybe they didn't want to be like telling stories about it because they would be afraid that what it might cause. I don't know. I'm curious because he did not lean into it. Ultimately, he kind of gave the reader an out to like kind of a wink and a nod. Like, this is the kind of story you can tell your children maybe because it's not really about a ghost.
Mm. Well, it's basically a cautionary tale as well,
Yeah.
like in a sense, but I'm not really 100% sure like where he's landing on like what the story's about, because it's like ultimately the guy who murders him potentially, wins in the end. And what was the moral of the story?
So cautionary tale, I think, is a apt description, because think about the character of Ichabod Crane, right? He is a schoolmaster who is described as being like almost a vagabond, right? Like he arrives in town to become the schoolmaster. He gets like a classroom, but he doesn't have a home. He like only has what belongings he could carry on in his knapsack, and he stays at the homes of the like students, right? Like he like goes around for different homes and stays with the families of these students.
Yeah.
And so he's this outsider, and there's a lot of talk about like how he's kind of a hit with the women of the town because he's more learned than like the farmers, right? Mm-hmm. And then it talks about like basically Brahm becomes the sort of figurehead of that like resistance, like how dare you come in here, right? And then I think like the cautionary tale of that too, right? Like maybe like the big city guy coming in and thinking he's going to be able to pull one over on the country bumpkins.
So
I don't know.
He's basically saying to like lay down roots and like be a normal citizen within society, and don't big time anybody. Don't like sort of like crash on people's couches. And
maybe, although Ichabod is also like the hero of the story, really. Like he's who we identify with most, I think. But it's funny though, because like the narrator is also like a character, right? Like the narrator, I don't think the narrator is supposed to be Washington Irving, but maybe it is. And he's like making commentary throughout, right? Like he's talking about women. Like there's a lot of like really obviously dated 200-year-old stuff about women in here. And like one of the most famous ones is talking about how he's dealt with all these different devils, and none of them prepared him for the challenge of a woman. Yeah. And that's like the narrator, right? Like the narrator talking about how he'd never quite figured out how to beguile a woman or something. It was weird. It was like he kept like inserting himself, and then later on when Ichabod goes to the feast, he's like, oh, I could keep talking about all these foods because they sound so delicious, but you're probably getting impatient, so let me carry on. And I was shocked. I was like, this felt like a very modern thing to have a narrator sort of inject himself into the story in this way. Mm-hmm. From a writer perspective, I guess. I don't know if anyone else cares, but I thought it was interesting.
No, I mean, I think it's cool. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Because it's like I haven't read a ton from this period of time, so like not a ton to compare it to, but I assume that it wasn't the norm.
Well, and I don't know if you picked up on this, but like the story itself is incredibly passive. It's very like I'm relating to you the legend of this. We get very few scenes, and much more of like summarizing what happened.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of direct dialogue. You know what I mean? Like there's very little of that. And I think that was definitely more of the time, but it feels very old fashioned. And that was something that was
little camp stories you would tell over ghost stories you would tell over a campfire kind of thing.
But without any dramatic scenes, which like is one of the best parts of telling camp, it's like, so you're leaving out all the dramatic bits. I mean, some dramatic stuff happens, don't get me wrong. It's just the way it's conveyed is a very like, he heard this tale about Ichabod Crane, and let me tell you about the tale of Ichabod Crane, rather than like, I'm going to tell you the story. I'm going to tell you about the story instead. That's like a small distinction, but I feel like that carries through.
It's just like a legend at that point.
Yeah.
It's just passing along a legend.
I couldn't help it. There was a part where he was talking about Katrina, and he just kept describing her as ripe and plump and fresh and like all this like weird stuff. And he's this school teacher who's, whipping his students. There's a long spot talking about his like use of the birch and how
he believes in punishment, and he's doing the work for their parents and stuff.
Yeah, like he doesn't like to beat the like weak children, so instead he beats the strong children like twice over. It's like,
something about like don't spare the rod,
spoil the child, whatever. Yeah, that whole thing. Yeah, it was pretty tough. Like I mean, it's 200 years old, so like I wasn't expecting anything less than that, but I was kind of shocked at how much of the story was like kind of horny and like talking about the farm girl and stuff. And then I found out Katrina is named like the exact name of a real person that he met, a real daughter of like a farm person that he met, and like asked like, hey, can I put your daughter in a story? And he was like, yeah. And he's like, I'll change it around, but I like to use real people's names. So that makes it even creepier. This was the exact real name of a person that he had met, a young woman.
Super weird.
So okay, Irving. He at one point he's describing her like delicious feet, I think, at one point. I was like, oh, okay.
Awesome. Great work.
Also, Ichabod Crane was apparently the name of somebody he met. Like he liked to use real people's names and just put them right in his books, which is, interesting. I wouldn't recommend it these days, but
I was gonna say, like, you're just like
probably not gonna get sued in 1800s.
You're just I don't know. You're setting yourself up if you met these people. Hopefully they don't come back around.
Well, and
say,
also
like, hey.
You could probably have a safe bet they're never gonna read it, but I don't know.
True.
I did think it was really funny where it was like he was renowned for having read several books all the way through.
Yeah, that was so funny to me. I was like, damn, we're geniuses back then. I want to
put that in my bio. I'm renowned for having read several books all the way through. So good. Like I think like a third of the story is just him on the horse riding to the party.
Oh, it genuinely is. Yeah, I mean, by the time the horseman's even brought up, we're over halfway. Like, got to be over halfway. But yeah, I mean, I was surprised because I remembered some of the movie, but I was also, I didn't remember it enough to where this story didn't make me wonder how the movie actually interpreted some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. But clearly very different. And like I said before, I do like this idea of the ending, like sort of running away and leaving some sort of ambiguity. The only thing that's left was his hat and his, the smashed remains of the head or whatever
the pumpkin. Yeah, I mean
the pumpkin. Yeah.
And that's really fascinating, right? The idea of it almost being a prank, this heavily implication. It's like a twist ending, right? This was probably shocking to people. They're like, oh, I thought it was a real horseman, but there's a pumpkin at the end, so maybe it wasn't. This is it's very early blueprint for a story, but it's cool to see that, and to see like at its core, like what a good Halloween story can be. Obviously maybe not up to the standards of today when it comes to like the plot, but yeah, the cores.
But just bare bones, like you think of the structure of it and like the idea. You need a couple seeds and you can create something like this that can, obviously at that time could become such a classic piece of pop culture. I mean, culture,
American literature, I would say. This is an enduring piece of popular fiction for sure. That we're obviously here we are 200 years later still talking about it. So that's pretty incredible. I'm
sure that he knew. He was like, one day there'll be a podcast about Ichabod Crane.
I don't even know what it is, but two men hang out by the pea pods. I don't know.
It's like radio, but not.
There was definitely not radio, and when he died, 1859. You think? I don't think so.
But he predicted radio, which in turn predicted podcasting.
It's actually mind-boggling to think about how long ago this was. Like he was referencing in the story, like the Knights of Yore,
Revolutionary War.
Well, yes, but he was also referencing like the Knights of Yore, like fighting a dragon and stuff. And I was like, that was probably closer to him then than he is to us now.
Yeah. Just bringing up like the Revolutionary War, like he's writing this in like 1820. So he's way, how much closer to the Revolutionary War is he than we are to him at this point.
He met George Washington as a child.
Jesus
George Washington like came to his house and like blessed him or something. And he has like a painting of it that he commissioned and hung on his house for the rest of his life. Wild. Which I've seen a picture of.
That's what I mean. And so like it's it's interesting to see it in like American history, like in that way.
Yeah, it really is. Well, we've got a lot of movie to talk about, so I'm gonna hand it over to you now, and let's get into this Tim Burton Halloween classic.
Yeah, let's do it. So, I mean, we have to start off just by saying like our history with it at least a little bit. I'd love to hear like where you first saw it and like your thoughts on it.
For me, I think this is a movie I have seen all the way through once when it came out. Around when it came out, I was too young for it, and I think it freaked me out a little bit. 1999, I would have been like 14. Like this is a rated R movie, right? Like it feels like it should be, at least with the amount of gore.
Oh no, it is rated R.
It is, okay.
It is rated R.
Yeah, so it's got to be with the number of deaths and stuff. Like, yeah. And then it's a movie that I think was on at a lot of parties, and so I've seen bits and pieces of it a lot over the years. And that was one of the things that it immediately jumped out at me, is just how like this is the perfect Halloween party movie to just throw on the TV. Like it's so perfect for it.
I mean, Christopher Walken is the Headless Horseman, so it's like he's just up there looking crazy and screaming and stuff. So yeah,
I mean that's just one of a million things that makes it perfect for Halloween. Yes. But yeah, what about you, man? What's your experience?
I remember, I don't remember the first time I saw it, but it's definitely something I've seen a lot. It's one of those ones that like growing up, it was sort of in a rotation of movies that would be on around Halloween, and so I would end up watching it a lot. I do remember like understanding Tim Burton and like seeing filmmakers as their own individual like filmographies. And I remember like thinking of this movie and thinking about how, I don't know, when I was coming up, like goth was very cool, emo was cool. Like,
sure.
I remember going to Hot Topic and buying Nightmare Before Christmas stuff, obviously, like all that kind of stuff. A movie like this, anything Tim Burton really became associated with a lot of that culture.
Yeah.
And so I remember watching it many times for sort of those reasons as well, just like people talking about that sort of stuff in school. And so, yeah, like I've seen it many, many times, but I feel like I never really engaged with it like I did this time. I was like really analyzing it and trying to figure out
tends to happen with this podcast.
Yeah, especially after like having read the source material and knowing that it was like this ancient legend of a story basically. And I mean, I had fun with it. I this isn't my favorite Tim Burton movie, and I think like he's kind of at the height of his powers in certain ways. Like he's got the insane production design and like a great cast. But, I think he had the task of adapting something that was so short and like sort of adding on, and then he turned it into this sort of like murder mystery.
Yeah, tons of changes.
Pretty engaging.
Really, really different story. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I don't know exactly where this falls in the line for Tim Burton, so I'm really curious to hear more about that. But yeah, I mean, my general takeaway from watching it this time is I kind of... Okay, first off, this movie is like all about aesthetics. Like, I feel like the way to appreciate this movie is to lean into the aesthetics that it's going for, because you have to understand that like that was more important than anything else. I think for Tim Burton was he wanted it to look a certain way, wanted it to feel a certain way, and that was more important than it making logical sense all the time. And then it really feels like just like someone setting out to make a Christmas movie. This was set out to make a Halloween movie. This is a Halloween movie, right? Through and through. And I feel like that is the goal of this thing. And then all of that is also bound up in what I kind of started to look at as like a horror camp. Like it was like kind of cheesy and silly, over the top levels of gore, and it was done in a way that was very self-aware and like having fun with it. Like this movie has like a joking wink and a nod tone throughout as it goes wild places.
And honestly, to jump in there, so does all of Tim Burton's movies, and that's something specific and distinct that I think we need to pull out of like sort of this like gothic sort of like German expressionism is something that I've talked about on the podcast a few times, but it's like early horror. You think of like Nosferatu, you think of like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you think about like a lot of this old German expressionism, which was a movement in film, which was elongated shadows and jagged architecture, and like you eventually would go on to see it in Dracula and a lot of the Universal horror movies and Hammer films, which I'll come back to with Tim Burton. But but there's a specific blend that Burton does where it's like this really zany and like comedic take to it. It doesn't take itself seriously.
Yeah.
But it is very like there's gore, there's killing, there's a lot of like things that are difficult to grapple with being sort of connected to a quirky character like Ichabod in this story. Like he's squeamish and he's a police officer who's like chasing down murders and stuff like that's the kind of like you think of Edward Scissorhands or Beetlejuice or any of these movies, like it's like this weird, like Beetlejuice is like you're grappling with death, but it's very funny, and you have a character like Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice, and you're like, that's sort of like, and there's color in it, whereas like normally you would think of it as just black. This film not as much, but Beetlejuice is like very colorful. Right. This movie like set out to be like, we wanted to. I've read that they wanted this to be black and white. and there was like no way that the studios were going to let that happen. And he was like, okay, well then we're just going to make it look blue, and we're going to throw a ton of smoke in it for contrast, and like up the contrast in post. And
then every now and then you'll see this like candy red blood that is just like, obviously made to really pop against all that, muted color.
Apparently because of the filters they were using, there's like blue filters on the cameras. The ooze that we're seeing, the actual liquid, was like orange in real life. Wow. And then like in order to make it look red.
Well, it didn't look real, so you know what I mean. Like it looked over the top and ridiculous. So it's interesting they had to do that to get that effect.
Something else that you brought up though is like the campy nature of it. Like it really is campy, and that has to be something that you're signing on for. I can really see people pushing back against this movie if they're like wanting a really serious like horror or spooky film, because like this is like a specific, almost comedic sort of horror film.
I agree, man, because I think my memory of seeing this is I didn't get it. I was like, the tone was so weird to me. I couldn't figure out how I was supposed to watch the movie. It was like, it was being silly, yet it was like so many people were dying and it was so bloody. And usually if that happens, it's like a more serious movie, I think young teenage Luke just didn't really know how to wrap my head around this movie. And so I just kind of was like, well, that was weird. And then I moved on. And I don't know what age I would have needed to be for me to like really get it. But coming back to it now, it made a lot more sense. I was like, oh, okay, I can see what he's doing here. You know what I mean? Like, whether or not it hits you and like it's the kind of thing you're interested in, I'm like, I get what he's doing and what he's doing on purpose. And this isn't like accidental shit where he's just like not understanding how physics work. And, it's just like, whatever. He's having fun with it. He's doing things for a deliberate purpose. And he wants to make a Halloween fucking ass movie. And this is it.
Yeah. He set out to, so I'm sure you noticed like the prank scene plays out in the movie. Yeah. Like we actually get the prank scene. Like, so he set out to make a Sleepy Hollow film that was like referencing a lot of the things that he loved about some of the, like the original story, and even some of the adaptations, like the Disney adaptation. I was reading that like there are references to that in this version as well. But one of the specific things, I'm going to get into Tim Burton a little bit now, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about this, but Hammer Films were specific. They're a production company that were making horror films. I think they're still around, honestly, but they were really massive, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that ultimately shaped Tim Burton, I think, a lot. And I think he set out in this movie to make one of those Hammer films, because a lot of those Hammer films had people like Vincent Price.
Those are the like movie, like the monster movies you're talking about. Those are the Hammer films.
Yeah, those are like I'll get into some of them, but like Christopher Lee was like Dracula in like the, I think it was probably like the 50s or 60s, probably the 60s. Bringing Christopher Lee into this film is his way of being like, I want to make one of these movies. Like I want to make these. Like,
I was so happy when I saw Christopher Lee. My wife was in the other room and she's like, "Is that Saruman?" I was like, "Yep."
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so let me read you a little bit about Tim Burton for you. Timothy Walter Burton is an American film director, producer, writer, and artist, known for his gothic fantasy and horror films such as Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, Ed Wood, Sleepy Hollow, and Frankenweenie. Burton also directed the superhero film. Just to throw that out there, this list has Ed Wood in there. That's not a gothic fantasy or horror film, but
it's one of his films.
It's a good Tim Burton movie.
Okay.
So Burton also directed the superhero films Batman in 1989 and Batman Returns in 1992.
I didn't know he did the original Batman, or not the original Batman, but the 1989 Michael Keaton Batman.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was what I was saying.
So that is extremely important, because that Michael Keaton, Tim Burton Batman changed Batman forever. Yeah. Like he took what was campy in Batman in like the 60s Batman, and the comics honestly hadn't gone as dark. And I think he like defined Gotham, which is going back to you talking about Gotham.
Yeah.
So Gotham in the comics, like he redefined sort of like the Art Deco, like Gothic style that you would go on to see because of that Batman movie. And then ultimately, like you can see the lineage like continue on. Like the Batman stories got darker, more shadows, more taken seriously, and then eventually you get something like Christopher Nolan's Batmans that are like a grounded, going away from that a little bit, but still within the same vein. You can still see the connections there.
I just as a quick aside, I've been rewatching the Marvel movies with my wife, and we just watched Spider-Man Homecoming, and Michael Keaton's in it, and I was like, he used to play Batman, and I was like telling her about the original Batman because I don't think she's ever seen it.
You know what's awesome is if you watch Birdman, if you watch
I haven't seen that, but I've heard it's good.
If Keaton in that, so it's like sort of all a send up to the superhero stuff, and it's an incredible movie. But it's funny to think about Keaton situated as like Batman, and then you did this Birdman movie that's sort of like it's making commentaries on superhero films, and then he goes and does Spider-Man: Homecoming. And honestly, that scene with Tom Holland and he when he's bringing his daughter to the dance, where he's like pulls the gun on, that scene's amazing. Really, that scene's awesome.
Yeah, he's really good in it. But
Keaton's awesome.
Anyway.
Yeah. All right, so Burton has often worked with actor Johnny Depp and composer Danny Elfman, who has composed scores for all but 3 of the films Burton has directed. So I found this really interesting Vox article. Didn't he also do
Big Fish, or is that not Tim Burton?
He did, yeah.
Okay.
Big Fish is a great movie. Yeah. So I found this Vox article about Tim Burton's visual aesthetic explained, and I definitely want to point people towards it because I got a lot of great information from it. But I had forgotten that Burton got his start working as an animator for Walt Disney Studios.
Wow.
So so there's a lot to this story. I want to read it here. I'm going to get into it. So Burton attended California Institute of the Arts, Cal Arts, which is a massive school for animation specifically, which opened in 1961, partly out of the last great vision of Walt Disney himself. During his schooling, there was a legendary era of Cal Arts animators, including famed Disney animator Glen Keane, The Nightmare Before Christmas director Henry Selick, Brave director Brenda Chapman, and Lion King director Rob Minkoff, as well as Brad Bird, the director of The Incredibles. This group of animators coming in who would they were trying to like push the boundaries and do new things and continue to like innovate within Disney. And it just so happens that Burton was caught up in all of this, and he was one of the people who was a part of this crew of people. Like they were all like fairly close. And this is how you can see Tim Burton create Nightmare Before Christmas and then have Henry Selick, who was a classmate of his, direct Nightmare Before Christmas. And there's a lot, I read a lot about how much stop motion means to Tim Burton, and obviously that's the case with a lot of the things we've seen. Frankenweenie's his eventual adaptation of Frankenweenie, which is about a boy whose dog dies and he's like wanting to resurrect his dog.
Wow, I've never seen that.
It's interesting, and the reason it's interesting is because he originally made it as a film that he pitched to Walt Disney, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me read a little bit more. One of his student films earned him attention from Walt Disney Studios, which brought him on as an animation apprentice after his graduation. While at Disney, he developed the concepts for a number of films that Disney initially rejected, including The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Wow.
He managed to produce a few works for Disney that showcased what would later become his instantly recognizable art style. A short film called Vincent, an homage to the actor Vincent Price, known for his appearance in Hammer horror films. So that was like his first standout thing that he created with Disney. And like I said, the legacy of Hammer horror films is like can't be overstated. They're basically like modern horror owes everything to Hammer films.
I think Vincent Price was in one of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow adaptations. I forget which one, but I remember seeing that.
I believe it. So Vincent Price, even more so than Christopher Lee, Vincent Price was like defined Hammer horror films. He was in all of them, all the way through. And Burton really wanted Johnny Depp to sort of play a Vincent Price role in this movie. Yeah. He was like, play Vincent Price in all these
we covered Hammer films. Was it The Last Man on Earth? Is that the name of that adaptation? We did as a bonus episode, and it was starring Vincent Price, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was our connection to it, because I'm not super familiar with Vincent Price, but I remember talking about him. I think in that episode we did that bonus.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about like how massive he was too. It was a bonus episode. Yeah. I don't know if we didn't end up releasing.
I think right now it's only on our Patreon feed. Yeah.
So Disney produced Frankenweenie, a story about a boy who tries to bring his small dog back from the dead in 1984, but then immediately fired him. So they were working with him. They were letting him do his unique stuff, but it was too dark for the time. It was like you see the dog die, and then he's like very like Frankenstein bringing this dog back to life and stuff. Dark. It's pretty. So they fired him, and this would create like a long-standing weird relationship, because obviously he would go on to work with Disney so many times. Like you think about the Alice in Wonderland live action that came out in like 2010. So like there's so many times that it comes back. Nightmare Before Christmas ultimately is under the Disney umbrella as well. But yes, ultimately, after he was fired from Disney, Paul Rubens Pee Wee Herman, who was another classmate of his at Cal Arts, he was studying theater at the time when Burton was there. He tapped Burton to direct a Pee Wee Herman film, like once Paul Rubens was Pee Wee Herman and was famous. And soon after that, he began this insane run. In 1988, he directed Beetlejuice, followed by 1989 Batman, 1992 Batman Returns, 1990 Edward Scissorhands, 1993 The Nightmare Before Christmas, which he produced and created, but left Henry Selick to direct, his Cal Arts classmate. He directed Ed Wood in 1994, Sleepy Hollow in 1999, Big Fish in 2003, Corpse Bride in 2005, Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street in 2007, and Alice in Wonderland in 2010.
There's a few other adaptations in there that we might be able to touch on in the future.
Yeah. And I'm sure that there are some others in there that I didn't add, but those are some of the most notable. And I was talking about like movies that had an impact, like Nightmare Before Christmas. Edward Scissorhands is absolutely in there.
I remember loving Beetlejuice, and it's one of those movies that like I wanted to go back and revisit for a long time.
You should.
Like, that would be a good Halloween movie.
A couple of years ago, I went back and actually, like, since the podcast has started, like maybe 2017.
Is Beetlejuice an adaptation?
No, I don't think so.
It was an original film?
I think so, yeah. I'm pretty sure, but maybe that would be wild.
Look into it, yeah.
Yeah, so I mentioned German Expressionism a little bit just because it's like so important to like his style, and I did want to talk a little bit more about like that very quickly just because like I want to do it justice. So I talked about it was like an art movement. It quickly expanded influence across Europe in the 1920s, drawing upon what was then the still new field of psychotherapy. Expressionist film became a cinematic medium in which the overall scenic and production design produced a feeling of dreamlike unreality and psychological tension for the viewer. The traits of Expressionism have become incorporated so successfully into certain modes of storytelling within art, cinema, and animation that the casual viewer might not realize these features all have a distinct origin point. Among the most distinctive features are sharply exaggerated backdrops and landscapes with high color contrasts, typically relying heavily on the use of shadows and silhouettes to heighten a feeling of tension or dread. Sets with jagged edges and alternately rounded, tilted, or visually disjointed and discombobulated spaces are another key element. So there's that's Expressionism, and then Gothic art. I'm sure that you're familiar with Gothic art, but Gothic architecture is something that's very distinct and people can see. But I think the difference in Gothic and Expressionism though is a lot of the time you're seeing like someone in a relationship lose someone, and like the mourning of that, and then also like large castles and like large spaces and like this, it's just like this overwhelming sense of like, we talked about it a little bit before, but when you take that Expressionism and that Gothic look in art and you blend them together, you get something that would become Tim Burton. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like you see something like Bloodborne is absolutely inspired by that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's cool, man. I love that whole vibe.
Another Gothic film that I think about often is Guillermo del Toro had this movie Crimson Peak come out a few years ago. Did you see that?
I did not.
It definitely goes more like thrills than this does. Like it's like more scares and like tension. Yeah. But like, God, it's like magnificent. Just to look at, you're like, oh my God, incredible. Like this, like I love Guillermo del Toro, and that movie. Like when I think of Gothic film now, I think of that movie.
I don't remember when we talked about this, but like literally in the last like 5 years, I think I've changed a lot on how I feel about campy movies across any genre.
Yeah.
And like I just like for the longest time I just didn't get camp. I didn't like it, and I've come around on that now. It's not my favorite mode of storytelling. But like I can appreciate it a lot more now. So
yeah, there's a lot of stuff we should go through and watch, adaptations and not. But
Francis Ford Coppola apparently was a producer of this movie. Is there like a story there? Like what's up with that?
Apparently Tim Burton didn't know that Francis Ford Coppola was an executive producer until like they were like in the edit bay. So they were like editing. Yeah. So I guess it was like specifically his production company was sort of like it was helping out. So I don't think there was a lot of creative. I don't know for sure. Maybe I just know that this story goes that Tim Burton didn't know until late in the process. Wow. So maybe Coppola did show up and help him out eventually. But yeah, it's pretty wild to see like those types of people start to collaborate, and like our projects are starting to mesh together.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that name.
Well, like have you seen Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula?
Who stars in that one? Is that Gary Oldman?
Yes, it is. That's the Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Coppola.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's been a while, but I remember it being pretty good. Definitely very intense.
Yeah. I mean, and that's like, clearly horror fans are connecting here. Coppola.
Hey, we might cover that one day. Actually, we've been needing to do a Dracula adaptation. That would probably be a prime candidate.
I would love to. Yeah, I haven't seen that in a long time either. But insane cast.
All right, man. Let's get into the plot of this movie so we can discuss.
Okay, so in 1799, New York City police constable Ichabod Crane is sent to the upstate Dutch hamlet of Sleepy Hollow, which has been plagued by a series of brutal decapitations. Received by the insular town elders, wealthy businessman Baltus Van Tassel, town doctor Thomas Lancaster, the Reverend Steenwick, notary James Hardenbrook, and magistrate Samuel Phillipsey, Ichabod learns that locals believe the killer is the undead, headless Hessian mercenary from the American Revolutionary War who rides a black steed in search of his missing head. Boarding at the home of Baltus Van Tassel and his second wife, Lady Van Tassel, he is taken with Baltus's spiritual daughter, Katrina. When a fourth victim is killed, Ichabod takes this victim's son, young Masbath, under his wing. Ichabod and Masbath exhume the victims and learn that a widow died pregnant. After Phillipsey tells this to Ichabod, the horseman comes and decapitates Phillipsey and leaves with his head. Ichabod, young Masbath, and Katrina venture into the western woods where a witch living in a cave reveals the location of the horseman's grave at the Tree of the Dead. He digs up the horseman's grave and discovers the skull has been taken, deducing that it has been stolen by someone who now controls him and that the tree is his portal into the living world.
There's some changes in this version.
Ichabod
Crane is now a detective, and we have to say, like, the heart of this story kind of becomes a murder mystery, at least for a while, and then at the end it kind of shifts again. But it is an interesting blend of genres, right? Like, you have the ghost story, you have the original story, and then you also have this murder mystery that now Ichabod Crane is at the heart of, which is very different than the story where he's just the school teacher.
I think it's an interesting device because I think we've talked about it in past projects too. It's like a cop is going to be able to interact with everyone in the society, everyone in this culture here, and so it is obviously interesting to seed it in like an 1800s cop who's also squeamish and seemingly
he's not a cop though, right? Like, he's just like an investigator who's been sent.
He's like an inspector or something.
Yeah. I don't even know what his official title is, but he's been sent from the city to come and just figure out what's going on with these murders. And he almost seems like a crime scene investigator a little bit too. Like, he's got all these
well, early on he's talking about science and reason and all that.
He's very sciencey, right? Like, and it's very clearly set up like he's going to be the science man coming in to be confronted with the supernatural. But he's got these instruments, which I was like, this is why I was talking about the aesthetic is so important, because there's several scenes where he's just pulling out these bizarre instruments and looking at them and fooling around with them. And I'm like, what is the purpose of this scene? I'm like, oh, it's just because this is a creepy looking medieval instrument and Tim Burton just wants to have this on camera.
I think he commissions things to be made like this. Like, he's got the glasses and stuff.
It's almost steampunk, but not, because it's it's goth punk. I don't know.
There's he has this thing, this little blade on a really thin piece of metal that just barely moves, and he's just using that apparently to cut into people or whatever. Really interesting. Obviously that's in keeping with his aesthetic too of Edward Scissorhands, and he loves when we get to the windmill eventually, the gears and all of the moving pieces and all that. He loves that kind of stuff. And I mean, it's a certain vibe, it's a certain type of backdrop, but I will say the production design in this movie is insane. The top tier, unbelievable. Whether you super connect with the story or not, what you're seeing on screen looks amazing. Even the early visual effects that they were using in 1999, a lot of that stuff looked really good.
mostly held up. There's kind of some jankiness, but I mean, it's 1999, so there's going to be a little bit here or there, but it does look pretty good. And I think what you're talking about with style, I think is very important to appreciate this movie, is to realize that Tim Burton is going all in on style. If there was a style knob, he broke it off. You know what I mean? He's he wants that to be the story on almost, right? Is the feel, is the vibe, is the look. He wants people to dress up as these characters for Halloween.
Yeah, and honestly, it really is, and it works because that's what people talk about when they talk about Tim Burton.
I think that's what makes this movie memorable.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is it's not forgettable. It's not something that's like it's not something that just like I'm like it is I would say this movie's fine. I think it's fine overall, but the reason that it isn't just a forgotten relic is because it has so much going for it. Yeah. I think it's like there's just enough there for you to like latch on to like film history and like his aesthetic and like what he's trying to do and his own blend of in the style and
like
the humor.
I mentioned how I liken it to like Home Alone, for example, being a Christmas movie, right? Like it's wrapped in all of the aesthetics of Christmas in such a way that it becomes almost a perfect movie to put on during Christmas. In the same way that this movie was made to be that for Halloween. And I think that's another reason why it has lasted. Because if you want to throw on a movie that is going to evoke the vibe of Halloween, like there are a few movies that are better than this. One of them is probably Nightmare Before Christmas, funny enough, the Tim Burton thing.
Yeah.
Although not directed, but I you know what I mean? Like he's very good at this kind of thing, clearly.
There's so much to talk about with this movie. We see like insane decapitations, which was fun.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it because I went into this movie not knowing that it was rated R, and I was kind of expecting a PG-13 vibe because, like, I feel like movies like this aren't really made anymore. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely not.
Like, again, we've talked about it. It's like this. It feels like a mid-budget rated R horror movie in a way that like is now like lower budget stuff, or you got big blockbuster stuff, like It Chapter 1 or something, right?
Well,
like,
and it's even an anomaly for horror movies at the time because it's not like normally if you're gonna spend mid-budget on a horror movie, it's gonna be like we're rated R, check this shit out, and they're gonna go.
Yeah,
like,
but this feels aimed at teenagers, yet it's rated R. Like this feels like a movie that 16-year-olds are supposed to be sneaking in to watch. To me, at least.
Yeah, and then there's like extreme efforts made that for like costuming and like a lot of these effects. These set, like I read like 70% of this movie's set is shot in studios and on sets that they've created. So
it kind of looks that way.
They created the entire town, and it does, but they did a good job of disguising.
Yeah, no,
like it does feel that way.
It does kind of look like a set, I guess. That's all. Like especially with the way the mist sort of obscures things in the distance. But it doesn't bother me because that's the vibe of the movie. We got to talk a little bit about Johnny Depp's performance. It's interesting to look at an actor now that has been so defined by a single role, even though he's been in so many iconic things over the years, that it like echoes back to earlier. Like,
yeah, you're saying specifically like Jack Sparrow.
I was noticing all the Jack Sparrow mannerisms in Ichabod Crane, And it was so weird to be thinking that, but I'm like, I see Jack Sparrow in Ichabod Crane right now. And it's interesting because it makes me go like, well, maybe this is just how Johnny Depp is, or just like something he brings to a lot of his roles, and I just didn't notice that before. It became like cemented in my mind for Jack Sparrow.
Yeah, I mean, say what you... I do think Jack Sparrow has kind of overstayed his welcome at this point.
Oh, for sure.
That's an absolutely unbelievably iconic character. Oh, no,
yeah.
That character
there's
like
a reason that they made so many movies. So they're trying to milk it for everything they can. And I think later movies, like Johnny Depp didn't give a shit. He was just there collecting a check at a certain point and doing a shtick. Almost.
I read that, definitely. I mean, I read Johnny Depp hasn't even watched Sleepy Hollow because he hates the way he acted in this film.
Really?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't know. It was like a goofiness, and it felt like he was like in on the joke in a lot of the scenes, right? With the way he would like, I don't know, like he jumped up on the chair and there was the spider, and just like the way he was like squeamish about the blood, and
he fainted like 100 times. He literally fainted like 5 times throughout the movie.
Really?
Yeah, he kept fainting. You didn't like you didn't pick up on that? Like he just kept doing this like whole like he was squeamish and he was like
getting
fainting,
like knocked down and stuff. I guess I didn't remember him fainting, but yeah, maybe he did.
He
definitely was like scrunching his face up every time blood was shown, but then he was also like performing autopsies on people, so it was. And then like he would like cut into some like weak old dead corpse, and like all this blood would shoot on his face for no reason. It was like, what? That's not how any of this works.
Well, it was like this like recurring gag for whatever reason that like he didn't like it. He was squeamish to this stuff, but then like he just kept getting like pelted with like globs of blood all the time and just
cherry red blood. Yeah.
So the body performance of the Headless Horseman is performed by Ray Park, who is kind of famous for like choreography, and specifically you would know him as Darth Maul in,
Phantom Menace.
Menace, yeah. So it's really interesting because like in that movie he's completely obscured by makeup and everything, but he's doing all the flips and all the choreography with the lightsabers. In this, I read how much Burton loved his performance and how much he brought like a physicality to the body, because there's no head, so really it has to be like exaggerated movements, and he thought he did a really great job. And honestly, I was looking for it and I was like, the choreography with the fight scenes is insane.
It's really good. I actually, I was gonna say, like, we're crediting Christopher Walken, and he is like, really interesting when is on screen, but I was like, whatever the stunt double is, and it's maybe not accurate to call him a stunt double. He's really just a performer at this point, who is the body the rest of the time. It's really good. Those action scenes are wild. They go on for a really long time. At one point, that wagon chase, I was surprised at how long it extended for.
I read that they were shooting that sequence for like 3 weeks or something insane like that. Like you're just constantly shooting that.
And I was remembering, like, that's one of the things at the time, is I was super into D&D, and I remember just loving the idea of dual wielding a sword and an axe and being a complete badass. And I wanted to like make a character like that or something. Or I can't remember how it manifested, but I remember like young Luke, who was deep into D&D, being just inspired by that.
Yeah, I mean it is very cool. So I'm gonna read some more plot. That night, the horseman kills midwife Beth Killian and her family, as well as Katrina's suitor Brom Van Brunt. When he attempts to intervene, Ichabod hypothesizes that the horseman is attacking select targets linked by a conspiracy. He and Masbath visit Hardenbrook, who reveals that the first victim, Peter Van Garrett, had secretly married the widow, writing a new will that left his estate to her and her unborn child. Ichabod deduces that all the victims are either beneficiaries or witnesses to this new will, and that the horseman's master is the person who would have otherwise inherited the estate, Baltus, a Van Garrett relative. Upon discovering the accusation, Katrina burns the evidence. Hardenbrook commits suicide, and Steenwick convenes a town meeting to discredit Ichabod, but Baltus bursts into the assembly at the church, announcing that the horseman has killed his wife. The horseman attacks the church, but is unable to enter. In the chaos, the remaining elders turn on each other. Steenwick kills Lancaster and is in turn killed by Baltus, who is then suddenly harpooned by the horseman, who drags him through a window and out of the church, and acquires his head.
And this is what I was talking about, like the Halloween stuff. Like, it was like ticking all the boxes, right? It was like, we got a gnarled, twisted tree of blood. We have a horseman. We have a witch in a cave. We have a spooky apparition that she sort of becomes. We have, like I said earlier, there's a spider. There's like a twirly shadow on the wall thing, with like a flying witch. Like, there's so many, like, and there's jack-o'-lanterns everywhere. There's just so much Halloween all throughout this movie.
The witch. So let's talk about some of the additions. Like, the addition of the witch felt like just we needed to add some sort of another supernatural element, like a witch, to explain the horseman in some way. And it is also interesting to think just the change of leaning into the fact that the horseman is supernatural and he's just coming from hell and killing people. And it's not, there's no ambiguity left. Like, we're going supernatural with this one.
He murders the entire family. He comes back for the little child and murders him, takes his head.
I read that the studio was not happy with that scene, and they were like, we can't have a kid be killed in this way. And Tim Burton was like, it's rated R. He's like, the thing that I hated as a kid growing up is seeing kids put in peril and then always saved. And he like really wanted kids to die in this movie. So like we get like an unborn child was murdered, like the pregnant mother was murdered, and then the kid, like that I mean, that scene's terrifying for a child. Like, he comes back for the child and pulls him out of the floor, and like, he's killed off screen.
Killed off screen, but he's like you see him shoving a third head into the bag. You're like, I remember that one of the cool things that something like that can do, as an audience member, and as a creator, right? Like, you're cultivating this attitude. You want the audience member to feel like you're out of your mind as a filmmaker. They're like,
that's what some people are trying to do, and Tim Burton clearly is doing.
Yeah, because when that happens, you're like, well, fuck, I don't know what's going to happen in this movie anymore, because I never expected that to happen. And once you can pull that off, like that's priceless. I think is to convince your audience member or your reader, if you're an author, that you're a little bit out of your mind. I think works. It's kind of unsafe. You're kind of unsafe. Not like a incredibly triggering thing, but maybe, I don't know, like you want to feel a little bit like you don't know what's coming, because if you start feeling too safe, you can get a little bored. So yeah, it's a fine line to walk, obviously, and there's considerations, but
yeah, I mean, it's it's bold, and it's obviously like his connection to Disney. He's had many connections to Disney, and I read something where he was like, honestly, it's normal for me to get fired by Disney at this point. I've been fired by them like 3 times and rehired. He just made Dumbo recently. You know what I mean? Like it's this whole cycle of everything. But that sort of connection might, some other filmmaker might be like, oh, I work with Disney, I don't want to go too far, and I think Burton's like, he's like, fuck it, let's do it, let's kill kids and stuff.
And you know what?
Sticking to a vision is, I think that's the ultimate goal for most artists. Like being able to stick out their vision, especially in a process like filmmaking where there's thousands of people involved in it, basically.
Yeah, I love that, to see Gunpowder, the horse, come right out of the story. Like that, there's a couple of like holdovers, right? Like he gets hit in the head with a pumpkin, Gunpowder the horse. There are certain things that
the prank
were there.
The prank played pretty well too. Like the first time he was I didn't remember. I didn't remember that the prank played out very similar to the book, and it worked for me.
All the dream stuff was very bizarre. As we realized that like his mother was into witchcraft, and she got, I think, thrown in an Iron Maiden by his father, and he got like injured on torture devices and stuff, like really dark. And then like the dreams themselves were like these bizarre little like vignettes, and one of them ends with his mother like hovering into the air, and you're like, is this part of the dream, or did this go down this way? I don't know.
I kept thinking that like he was trying to draw some parallel to like Ichabod didn't know it, but he was connected to Sleepy Hollow in some way. Like his mother may have been someone who was from this area, and like all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it was just the connection of the witch, like the sort of witchcraft, and then
which I guess ties him to the witchcraft of Katrina's character, right?
Katrina, that's what I was thinking.
Good witchcraft she's performing. It comes to be.
There's also the moment where, and like these two things did work for me. I bought hook, line, and sinker that Katrina was the person who was controlling the Headless Horseman when that moment was happening and he was leaving. I was like, oh shit, I forgot about that. That makes sense. Like that's a cool character. We've talked about like women being villains, and like how that it doesn't happen very frequently, and like what it can mean to actually like lean into that. And like he did it twice. Like I was like, oh, it's the father, and then I forgot that it wasn't the father, and I was like, oh, it's definitely Katrina. Like that makes so much sense. That's a cool twist, just, dagger in the back for Ichabod. And then the other twist is that it's the stepmother, and I'm like, of course it's the stepmother. How did I not see that?
Stepmother
like I knew.
We talked about that as Snow White, right? Like the evil stepmother.
Well, and when I say the other twist worked for me, I was like, oh, it's not the father, it's the stepmother, and I thought that for a good part of the movie. And then he does the husband comes in and says my wife has been killed, like off screen. That happens, and he shows up at the church, and I'm like, oh shit, I was wrong. He subverted the stepmother trope, and then he really subverted the subversion.
Yeah, man, subverted you right out of your seat, apparently.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm with you. It was surprising, but as we're getting there, I do feel like the last act of the movie is kind of the weakest. I
think once the reveal happens, the rest of it was kind of.
I mean, like it's silly action throughout, but it gets like even more silly. Yeah. I really didn't like the design of the dress that the stepmother's wearing at the end. For me, it felt very out of place. Even in this like very stylized era, in this very stylized film. Just for that time period, I was like, I don't know about this. It was very like it reminded me a little bit of like Other Mother from Coraline or something, like trying to evoke the spider web and stuff.
I actually think I read something that it was like a reference to Beetlejuice or something.
Okay,
like that,
I could see that. It felt more like a Beetlejuice.
It kind of feels like that, and like and in that way, it does feel out of place.
Exactly.
Like you said, like that vibe doesn't really like go together perfectly.
Yeah.
But let me finish up this summary real quick, and then we can finalize our thoughts. Initially concluding that Katrina controls the horseman, Ichabod discovers that the diagram she drew beneath his bed and in the church during the meeting, which he believes summoned the horseman, is really one of protection, and additionally finds a post-mortem wound on Lady Van Tassel's decapitated body. Lady Van Tassel, alive and well, emerges from the shadows and reveals herself to Katrina as the master of the horseman. She faked her death and used the planted headless body of the Van Tassel's servant girl, whom she had killed previously. She takes Katrina to a local windmill and explains her true heritage from an impoverished family evicted years ago by Peter Van Garrett when he favored Baltus and his family instead. She swore revenge against Van Garrett and all who wronged her family, pledging herself to Satan if he would raise the horsemen to avenge her by killing them, which would also allow her to claim the Van Garrett and Van Tassel estates uncontested. She used fear, blackmailing, and lust to manipulate the other elders into her plot, having eliminated all other heirs and witnesses, as well as her sister, the crone witch, for aiding Ichabod. She summons the horsemen to finish Katrina. Ichabod and Mazbath rush to the windmill as the horseman arrives. After an escape that destroys the windmill and a subsequent chase to the Tree of the Dead, Ichabod retrieves the horseman's skull from Lady Van Tassel and returns it to him, breaking the curse and setting the horseman free from Lady Van Tassel's control. With his head restored, the horseman spares Katrina and abducts Lady Van Tassel, giving her a bloody kiss and returning to hell with her in tow, fulfilling her end of the deal. Ichabod returns to New York with Katrina and young Mazbath, just in time for the new century.
I just keep thinking about the different forms at play here, right? Like, you have the classic horror tale, then you have the mystery, which I think kind of culminates in this parlor reveal scene where he makes some accusations, even though it's just like one guy. It's just this one guy who he's laying it out to, and he's wrong about a lot of stuff. But that feels like it's kind of the culmination of that mystery plot until the twist happens, right? And it's revealed that he's been wrong about all this. And then it like simultaneously goes into this other kind of mode of storytelling where you have a villain who is monologuing and outlining her entire plan, and we're seeing flashbacks that like fill in the blanks. And it's like kind of in keeping with mystery, but it's also, I don't know, it's very like cartoony almost, right? Like it's almost ridiculous. And you know, in that sense, it's like you live by the camp, you die by the camp, I guess, because like maybe that works for some people, but it was getting to be a bit too much, too tropey, too something for me. Where it started losing me.
And I agree with you. I think once the reveal comes, the story's completely downhill at that point. Like, we're at the bottom of the hill, and like everything's been revealed to us with that twist, and then we get the extended like kind of extra bit where she, like you said, she's monologuing. They have the extended fight with the horsemen and like the back and forth with the skull and who can control it.
It's really like, ridiculous. She's hiding it behind her back and stuff, and I'm like, he's headless. Like, he's not seeing with his eyes. So how can you just hide his skull behind your back and he doesn't notice it?
It did just feel like the story had run its course at that point, and it was like kind of just like overstaying its welcome a little bit for sure.
I do got to shout out that Tree of Death though. What a fucking bizarre, cool. Like, he's cutting into it and there's just blood spurting out onto him. And then I'm like, well, what are we going to see here when he cuts into it? A whole pile of heads and just swimming in a sea of blood. It is like incredibly dark and well, when he gory.
And that's like the gateway to hell when he drags her in.
It's the gate to hell. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, when he drags her in, it like fucking just blends her.
And the whole horse jumps into it. Like that. Oh man, this movie's wild. And honestly, when it's doing that wild shit, it's kind of working at its best, I think. And when the horseman, I guess, is also just like an unstoppable, whirlwind of carnage is also when he's at his best. I mean, spearing Baltus through the window and yanking him out into the graveyard, like, that was so epic. Like, I don't know, it was amazing.
Yeah, it just fits. It's in keeping until it's not, right? Like, I love all of that stuff, and then I think some of it goes a little far, but. Yeah, I mean, the cast is unbelievable. Like, Ian McDermott is in here, Richard Griffiths, Christopher Lee we talked about, Michael Gambon. We got
Christina Ricci. We gotta shout her out. She's really good.
In a really interesting role too. Like, the fact that she was like
did
somewhat.
Tim Burton do the Addams Family?
I don't think so. I actually just looked it up. It was not Burton who directed. It was Barry Sonnenfeld. But Barry Sonnenfeld directed Get Shorty, which we covered a while back. But that's Christina Ricci in Addams Family Values.
So many weird connections. Yeah, and I feel like she's known for those movies, right? And the reason I bring them up is because those movies have that vibe, right? Like that horror Halloween vibe. And so it's interesting to be like, I'm going to take Christina Ricci, who's now a little bit older, and put her in my horror like Halloween movie, and it works.
Yeah. It does work, right? That connection, and you're getting built-in fans too, like those fans who are coming along with the Addams family.
So when they returned to New York at the end, it really highlighted something that I was noticing throughout, and that is that apparently in Tim Burton's world, at least for this movie, there are no people of color that exist in America. There is not one. I don't think I saw a single extra when they came back to New York City. There was a person of color.
I want to say there was criticism leveled against Tim Burton because like something came out about how he didn't want black people in his films or something insane like that. I don't know if that was an exact quote or I just remember like vaguely something about that. Now that you say that,
and I noticed
it's like it's clear. Yeah, it's very blatant that like he has no people of color, like you said.
Yep, no good. But man, this movie, it was an experience. It was. I enjoyed it more this time than when I originally saw it, and I think it was because I have changed a little bit on camp. It was because I could watch it in like a new way, and then comparing it to that original source, having just read it, it was cool to see a filmmaker coming in very clearly of like, I'm going to take this old story and I'm going to put a spin on it. And I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to make my own piece of art that that differs greatly. I don't know. It's cool to see. It's like we talk all the time about like what makes good adaptations, and like, you know, you can go the super faithful route, or you can go this route, or you can go somewhere in between. But like this is definitely in that like Doctor Strangelove, like certain ones we've covered where it's like extremely transformative adaptation. Yet I think the result is still pretty good here. Sometimes great. I don't know. I guess we got to debate like, was this greatness or not? I don't know. But you know, what are your thoughts on this film as a whole? I
love filmmakers who are like sponges for things that they love, who absorb and blend and create and anew. And I love like even something I didn't mention, like the windmill is so clearly a reference to Frankenstein. Like the windmill going up in flames and everything is so much like a Frankenstein homage. In a horror story like this. But just to see him grab everything like this and like to use the influence and the power that he had at the time to create a movie like this, I think is really interesting. And like you know, to create your own style is so difficult to differentiate yourself from other filmmakers in that way, and to make big swings, to take big swings like this. I think it's do you want to try to see which was better?
Because I think we're at the end. We got to vote on which was better, story or film. And now, you know, what's interesting is like there's a lot of other adaptations for this, so I like that we've sort of given ourselves some options for bonus content in the future. There's definitely a lot of stuff that we could touch on, but the question is, of these two, right, which is better? Very difficult thing to compare. I mean, obviously separated by over 100 years, you know, in different mediums. I think I know where I land, though. Do you want me to go first, or you want to go?
I'll go first real quick just to say because I'm kind of formulating as I go, but I think the legacy can't be overstated also in this story, right? Like this story clearly exists with or without this movie, because there's been so many adaptations, there's been so many versions of it. But in this case, I'm going to take the movie for the sheer fact that like I think seeing something as stylized and created by somebody like Tim Burton, this is the version that will always stick out to me personally, and it might be because it's, you know, we saw it at a formative time in our lives. But I think like having a filmmaker like this, at least showing the example that like filmmakers can take these big swings and can create their own genres almost, and like have their voices heard in these ways. Like that's something I definitely want to promote. And like, you know, if he did make statements about how he didn't want black people in his movies, like fuck him. I don't think that that's cool at all. And I think that that's a reason to not celebrate him. But I do think like seeing someone have such a specific style is really interesting in filmmaking, and I do want to see more of that from new artists as they come up.
Who maybe don't have so many racial problems. I don't know. We don't know exactly what he said. We should just put it out there. But I have also heard some rumblings, which makes me uncomfortable. Story versus movie, though. I was on the fence for a while on this one, like trying to figure out where I landed, because the story is so old. And we talked about like the Katrina stuff where Washington Irving, you can feel him kind of perving out about this like young woman that he once met through the story. So that was a little weird. But like, if I'm going to forgive somebody, I'm going to forgive someone from 1820 a little more than I'm going to forgive the 1999 Tim Burton. And so like a lot of that stuff, I was expecting it, and it didn't completely ruin the story for me. Take that with a grain of salt. And it's not like it's like a particularly spooky story or anything these days, but I think I am going to give it to the story. As much as that aesthetic and that style is cool for the film, I have to give it up to this like groundbreaking foundational story in American literature. This enduring piece of horror fiction. This author who fought for authors' rights early on and fought for copyright law and like wanted to be paid for his work and celebrate authors as a profession. All these things are bound up in this guy and in this story that I think are so cool. And I'm really glad that I was able to like learn about it, because honestly, I didn't know this. For whatever reason, we must have skipped over Washington Irving in my Florida American Lit classes, or maybe we did, and I just wasn't paying attention, because that is definitely possible. Yeah, man, I'm gonna give it to the story ultimately. I think that's right.
It makes sense. I mean, the story is like that's a legend for a reason at this point. It literally is a legend.
I agree. So yeah, whenever you're listening to this, maybe you did listen to it later in the year. Thank you for joining us for it. And having a little bit of horror. Whenever it finds you, it's definitely always fun. I want to shout out our patrons. Just thank them for supporting us. I realize that's not something we've been doing as much lately, because we kind of changed up the way we begin our shows. But yeah, I mean, like, this wouldn't be possible without our patrons. So if you wanted to find out how you can support us too, check out our Patreon. And we've mentioned some bonus episodes a few times on here. We put them out every month, and we have lots of content on there now that you could check out if you wanted to support us financially.
If you want to connect with us on social media, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film.
And if you wanted to support the podcast in another way, but you didn't want to have to spend any money, we always love to see a rating and review, which, by the way, just as an aside, I went through and I was like, I got to like put my money where my mouth is. Well, that's not the right term because it's free, but I was like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to rate some podcasts that I've been listening to for a while, and I've never like given them a written review. And I knocked out like 5 or 6 right in a row. And I went back and I was like looking today at one of them, and I read what I wrote, and it was super awkward. I said the word podcast, I think 3 times in 3 sentences. And I was like, this is cringy. And I realized that I'm like, I think this is one of the stumbling blocks for people, right? Like, you get self-conscious about like, what am I saying? Am I saying it in a way that makes sense? Or am I going to come off weird or cringy? And like, I'm here to say that like, I totally like, I did that, and I wrote something incredibly cringy, but like, I'm still glad I did it. I'm still helping the podcast out. I'm sure they're still happy to get the 5-star, and it still does help. So like, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? Like, it's a weird form. You're typing it on your phone. I understand that you don't get a chance to necessarily review it, but like, the reviews help no matter what. Don't let that be a stumbling block. We all do it, including me, apparently.
Yeah, I need to be better about that, honestly. I should go leave some more reviews.
Yeah, man. How are you going to ask people to leave us reviews if you're not doing it, right? That's what I realized.
I need to, yeah. Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
Absolutely. So, thank you for waiting for the end of the episode. We are going to announce our next project. We are going to be getting into Shadow and Bone by Lee Bardugo, I think is how you say the name. I'll double check on that for next week. Make sure I'm getting it right. Netflix adaptation going to start coming out soon. We will be covering the entire novel, I believe, next week, and then we'll be getting into the TV show, which we're going to do in 2 parts, dividing the season in halves. So yeah, we're excited to get into a YA fantasy story, which since we haven't done any Harry Potter in a long time, and maybe we're not going to do it again. I don't know. It's nice to get a different piece of YA fantasy that we hopefully can sink our teeth into, and hopefully can be really fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm ready to check it out. It should be. I mean, it's Netflix. I hope they do it justice.
I hope so too. And we will find out next week at least what the source material is like. Thanks for joining us, and until next time.
Thanks for listening.